All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third biennial New York City Food Waste Fair. We have a very great conversation lined up for y'all today. But before we get started, I wanted to give people a few reminders. So one, we unfortunately are no longer going to have an interpreter for this panel. It's unfortunate, but they were not feeling well and dropped out. And so I apologize for the inconvenience there. And other reminders I have, one, don't forget to use that Q&A function. We will be taking questions at the end. They have a lot of interest, our panelists have a lot of interesting things to say, so ask as many questions as you want. Please submit questions. And then my last reminders have to do with the Food Waste Fair in general. Check out, there's still more events through Saturday. And so there's 2 panels on Friday. We have some volunteer events to sign up for. So please check those out on foodwastefair.com. And I would also like to encourage you to check out the Food Waste Toolkit, which is a guide for New York City businesses and residents to learn about how to reduce their food waste. And you can find that at foodwastetoolkit.com. So thanks for coming. And without further ado, I will throw things over to V.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Vitus Spehar, the Executive Director of Everything Food and the former Director of Impact and Entrepreneurship for the James Beard Foundation. Absolutely thrilled to be talking with 2 of my friends and colleagues, Clare and Madeline Rotman, about one of my most favorite topics, food as medicine. Now, when you hear the saying food is medicine, you're probably conjuring up some images of like food pyramids or like prescription pads reading like take to farmer's market as needed. And while that is part of how the process works, all 3 of us have programs that address the impact of healthy food access on chronic illness management. And we even have a program together called FoodFarmacy that partners with the healthcare industry to source and deliver fresh, healthy foods to patients who want to build better health through food. But what we're going to talk about today is what if the food as medicine treatment alleviated not just some of the symptoms that caused food-related chronic illness, but also led to systemic transformation of the food supply chain and the economy as a whole. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about how innovative businesses like EveryTable and Imperfect Foods are disrupting the food supply chain to unlock the physical, mental, and financial health for the communities that they serve. In the conversation, we will talk a little bit about the process of building a mission forward and financially sustainable business, and also probably a little bit about the specific food pharmacy solution that we've developed together. But wanted to let folks know that this is going to go far beyond just what we work on, and hopefully inspire you to come up with some new creative ideas, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space. And it truly is the way that we can transform communities sustainably. So with that said, I want to introduce Madeline Rotman and Clare Fox, starting with Madeline, Maddie, the head of sustainability for Imperfect Foods, dubbed America's favorite grocery delivery company, offering imperfect yet delicious produce, affordable pantry items, eggs, dairy, protein, comes to my house every week, absolutely love it. Imperfect's stated mission is to eliminate food waste and build a better food system for all. Now, when you say food waste, what do you mean? Where is this waste coming from?
Thanks so much for having me, V. This is so fun. So when we talk about food waste or sort of surplus excess food in the food system, it's really robust. So when Imperfect started in 2015, it was just tackling farm level food waste, sort of produce, fruits and veggies that were left in the field in Northern California only. 6 years later, we've grown tremendously, and we basically are working with a network of farmers, producers, suppliers to save food that would be wasted or sort of not have a home across the supply chain. So that still exists as food that would have been left in the field, product that maybe doesn't have a market or a buyer pulled out, as well as when we talk about sort of the grocery space, anything that's surplus or excess from changing markets Again, we all went through this pandemic for the past year and a half. Institutions went down, restaurants weren't available to purchase food, cruise ships didn't have purchasing power anymore. So enabling us to be that flexible purchaser in the space to ensure that no food would go without a home, that's the waste. So it's not just something that was going, this imagination or this visual of going into a dumpster. It's not, what we're talking about is not old, moldy, anything like that. What we're talking about is delicious, nutritious food that just doesn't have a home or a market, or could have been left in the field. And we want to make sure that can get directly to a consumer.
Yeah, so it sounds like extra. It sounds like, I mean, that made sense to me, especially when you think about cruise ships or casinos or places that these supply chains were delivering to that just stopped. Now, oftentimes when there's extra, just to ask you one more question before we kick over to Claire, is this something that could potentially negatively affect donations to food pantries, food shelters, places like that were collecting extra previously?
Yeah, it's such a good question. When we think about the food ecosystem, we all play together. Refed put out their insights engine this past year, and they do it annually. If anyone hasn't seen it, highly recommend. And it really showcases the sort of space of excess food. This is about a third of food that's produced in the US doesn't get consumed. About 2% of that is making it to food banks and food pantries. So the size of excess food in the US and globally is massive. So this is a massive problem, and there's not one solution. We work hand in hand with food banks and pantries and a ton of food access partners and nonprofits on the ground. And we donate a lot of food and work with them on those programs. But the challenge is there's infrastructure needed, there's people needed, and there's money needed to go back into the system. And so when we sort of think that all of this excess can go to food banks or pantries, it's just not true. They're a huge piece of the puzzle, but there are other market solutions. And that's how Imperfect fits in as being a player in this space that holds hands with our food banks, with our food access partners, and with our growers to ensure that this is a robust ecosystem that we're building. There's not just one straight line.
Exactly. Perfect. And to your point, and to some of the folks writing in the chat, even the food pantry and rescue is not a completely standalone sustainable solution, right? That doesn't put any more money in the farmer's pocket. It doesn't put any more money in a job seeker's pocket. It is part of it, but it's not. It only addresses a very small piece of what's going on with the food system. So Clare Fox, our other guest for today, former executive director at the LA Food Policy Council, now the vice president of strategic partnerships at EveryTable, the #1 meal delivery service in LA, also mission driven, also not a not-for-profit, whose mission is to transform the food system to make delicious, nutritious food accessible to everyone, everywhere. So I also read on your website that EveryTable is aiming to redefine the food landscape the same way that McDonald's did 50 years ago, replacing fast food with fast, healthy, fresh, affordable food. Talk to me a little bit about the economics and the financial feasibility of that kind of a switch.
Yeah, thanks, Bea. And so good to be here this afternoon with everybody. I think this is such a great question, especially when framing it in terms of food as medicine and the sort of domination of fast food in our food landscape, in our neighborhoods, right? Fast food companies are the largest food companies in the world alongside consumer packaged goods. And so I think it is really valuable to take a step back and try to understand why is that and what is their business model and how do we sort of go toe to toe with that to provide an alternative, which is fresh, healthy food at affordable prices. I'll start with just a brief word about EveryTable and kind of elaborate a bit on what we're offering as a mission-driven company. We believe that healthy food is a human right. So that's sort of what guides our work. And unfortunately, today, it's more of a luxury product than a human right. And so as a company, we have set about to provide made from scratch, fresh, healthy meals at fast food prices. And not only to do that, but to successfully bring them into historically underserved communities, low-income neighborhoods, communities of color that some would describe as food deserts, or food apartheid is another way to think about it, which is to say there's unequal access to fresh and healthy food in our built environments, in our communities, and that has long-lasting impacts on the health of communities. So when we talk about food as medicine, we have to look at what is available to folks in their own neighborhoods and at what price point, right? So let's talk about fast food. Let's talk about the McDonald's of the world and what they've done successfully. What they've done successfully is that they're producing food at scale in centralized production, and then they have national distribution. So we can think of like the hamburger patties or the hamburger buns. They're not scratch cooking that at each and every single McDonald's, right? They're really they're generating it, they're manufacturing it at scale in one centralized location, or maybe a few, sending it out to all their McDonald's locations where they assemble, reheat, and serve it, right? So in that model, they're achieving incredible efficiencies. We can look at consumer packaged goods too, like Pop-Tarts or Corn Pops, same thing. Mass production, centralized production, national distribution, and those are shelf-stable products, so they can just sit on the shelf. 80% of a grocery store environment is really made up of those kind of products. So major cost savings, major efficiencies. We also could talk about the fact that there's like federal government support for commodity ingredients that go into that. So already they're getting a subsidy. So all of that is driving down the cost to the consumer of junk food, right? That's why a burger and fries we could get for $6. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum, like a Sweet Green. And this is no diss on Sweet Green because I really like Sweet Green, but let's talk about why salads are $12 to $15. So a Sweet Green type model is almost the exact opposite of that centralized location, national distribution. Each and every single Sweet Green is its own unit of production, right? Ingredients come into the Sweet Green. The food is prepared on site, it's assembled, it's fresh served. We love that, it tastes delicious, but it's not very efficient. Each and every Sweet Green has its own set of equipment, its own labor force, right? You could think about the cost of real estate. They tend to be in higher income neighborhoods. Obviously, all of that combined drives up the cost of a delicious Sweet Green healthy salad, right? So a lot of times people will focus on the ingredients itself, like, oh, it must just cost more to produce an organic salad. It's actually the entire business model that you have to look at, and the efficiencies or lack thereof that either drive up or down the cost for the consumer. So our founder and CEO, kind of his entry point into this work was working with families in South LA, which here in Los Angeles is, the sort of largest swath of food desert neighborhoods, working with families who were super motivated to eat healthy, and really just didn't have that choice available to them in their neighborhood. And as a business person, he thought, okay, could we somehow replicate what McDonald's is doing, what the Corn Pops manufacturer is doing, but do that at scale with fresh, healthy food? And, it's so simple, but really that is the basis of the model and how it works, is that we have one central location where we're producing meals at scale and then distributing it out to multiple retail locations. So very similar to what the CPG and fast food companies are doing, but it's because we have that one central location and not multiple restaurants all across the county, that we're able to really keep our costs low to be able to serve a fresh, healthy meal for $5 or $6. In addition to that, because we have this commitment to food equity and we believe all communities should have access to fresh and healthy food, we're pricing our meals according to what is affordable in the neighborhood, because affordability is relative, right? So you'll find us in low income neighborhoods, you'll find us in higher income neighborhoods, same delicious meals, same retail environment, but it's going to be priced about $3 to $5 differently. And a lot of people will ask, oh, okay, so are the higher income stores subsidizing the lower income stores? And it's actually not the case at all.
Wow.
The stores in lower income neighborhoods are profitable in and of themselves. And again, that has everything to do with the business model, and it has everything to do with the fact that there's unmet demand. There are families who are looking for healthy food options, and they have to go all the way outside of their neighborhood to do so. Instead, we're keeping that dollar local, and they have that option, and it's priced to the median income. So it's truly affordable.
And that brings me to sort of a follow-up question that I was thinking about as you were talking about this, and the idea of like the subsidies and the attractiveness of bringing in McDonald's or something to a neighborhood, or the idea that sometimes a Sweet Green comes into your neighborhood or a Whole Foods and it's, it's a catalyst for gentrification, which obviously displaces a long-time residents. Can you talk a little bit more about, from the city planning, community planning, investment in cities lens, how is EveryTable doing it differently to to come in and serve, but not come in and displace. And is the city looking at you guys and saying like, hey, we want more of this, we'll invest in you too?
I love this question so much, because I think for anybody who's interested in community change and food justice, we always have to be asking ourselves the question, are our efforts investing in local ownership? And are we centering racial equity and social equity in our work? And EveryTable is a medium-sized business, and we're fast growing. Like, we really do want to go toe-to-toe with McDonald's, for real. So our hope is to have thousands of stores. And I should say that we're in LA, we're across Southern California, we're fast growing. We're also going to be opening up locations in New York in the next 6 months. So super exciting, and super excited to be among New York folks to make that announcement as well. For us, as a company with a mission, we had to ask ourselves, well, as we grow, how do we share in that growth equitably? And how do we grow in a way that invests in historically marginalized communities in a way that's going to generate true equity? And in the same way that we, have disrupted the food system by offering fresh, healthy food at fast food prices, we're also trying to disrupt the way we do franchising. And franchising is this model, we think about McDonald's franchises or Quiznos or Chick-fil-A. To be a franchise owner operator, it can be very lucrative, but you got to pay to play. I mean, there's a serious upfront investment for entrepreneurs. We're talking $500,000 to $1 million plus to get in as a franchise operator. So we had the question, okay, we're growing, we're opening new stores. Is there a way we can remove that barrier to entry to owning and operating an EveryTable business? What would that look like? And could we do that in a way that prioritizes entrepreneurs of color to become owner operators, to grow wealth through the ownership of an EveryTable store, but without having that upfront investment? Because that leaves a lot of people out who don't have access to traditional capital, who don't have generational wealth, right? So our approach to that, our take on that, we call social equity franchising. And essentially we partner with philanthropy to make capital available to entrepreneurs who are high on talent, but not very capitalized, and to give them the opportunity to step into that ownership role so that they're able to grow alongside with us. So I think to your question about, sort of how do we mitigate displacement? How do we mitigate gentrification? I think it always boils down to local ownership. And for us, our priority is really on entrepreneurs of color specifically, to become owner operators and to find entrepreneurs who are already out there, who have those aspirations, and to lift them up, build them up, invest in them, and give them an opportunity that they may not otherwise have.
Yep, and it's a powerful choice, and it is a choice. And I think that's the thing that we need to let people know. It's a choice. Sam, the founder of Imperfect, the founder of my company, they could have very well been like, we're just gonna be rich dudes and do what we want, but you have to make a choice. And in giving up a choice, you're also giving up power. You're handing over structures of power to people who are of these communities and saying, I've got something I think that you might want and that could potentially help. And when they say yes, giving that power over and letting them be the benefactor of that success and own those means of production and profitability. And that is a choice. And I think we need to push that more and more with legislation, is this idea as we continue to try to achieve equity and equality, it does mean that you're giving up power. It does mean that you're sharing the intellectual property that you had and that somebody else will benefit from that. And that is the point. That's the point. So there are, as we're continuing to talk about, food as medicine for our community, there are really three fundamental realities that have the most effect on successful businesses like ours, who are mission driven, who are food driven, and who are predominantly serving folks who are in a situation of being on the wrong side of the deal a lot of the time. And it could be the farmer, it could be the community, it could be the trucker, it could be the worker. So we're gonna now break it down into essentially three kind of buckets for the next couple of questions to keep things straightforward. So for me, I think having authentic and specific mission, and specific being important, equity for people, both the workers and the customers, everybody throughout the pipeline, and then the power of e-commerce and how we leverage that power for good. Starting with mission and coming back to Maddie, Imperfect started as Imperfect Produce. And like you said, it started as just doing the produce in Northern California. And it's now expanded to be, groceries, all different types of things. There's discount for SNAP, there's community investment programs, there's philanthropy. There's a lot more to it than just like trying to reduce the amount of waste in Northern California farms. How are you guys mitigating vision haze? When you're dealing with a problem as big as solving for systemic food inequity, how do you keep from losing focus or cannibalizing the missions of the people around you to try and have like one big conglomerate solution again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, Claire, I just love what you said around it's about the whole system. Like, it's not just the ingredients. And I know you're talking about something else, but it's just such a relevant point of, for us being the sort of the whole system, our vision is to sort of build a less wasteful, better food system for everyone. And that's broad. But the way we focus down is what do we do and how can we be great at what we're doing? Because when you try to sort of create a cookie cutter version of impact that says like, this is what you're supposed to do and here's how we'll execute it, that won't work. And we talk often to a lot of different companies that are not just food companies, but sort of other, whether it's in textiles or transportation or logistics, how do you sort of work towards this? And, mission haze is tough, especially in hyper growth. But for us, it's what do we do really well? So what we're really good at doing is being a logistics solution to a food waste problem. So food happens at farms and happens in production, and it needs to get to consumers to eat. And so being sort of the middle space of being this logistics provider, this marketplace in between, how can we get even better at working with our farmers and producers to know what they need, to work with them on putting more money back into the value chain by purchasing from them? And then how do we be better at delivering and executing that? And so I say that because we sort of sit in this middle of to not lose, we don't want to go for breadth and not be able to do depth. And so it's always a balance of breadth versus depth. But for us, it's those two areas. How can we be better at that? So we always started around how do we save food? And we transitioned from saving food from waste to saving food from lesser outcome. And I say that it's a nuance, but saving food from waste is really food that was going into a trash can, a compost, or getting left in the field. And lesser outcome is this larger bucket of food that may have been processed, may have been sold on the open market, may have been given to animal feed, all of these other sort of low energy usages, where if we can give it to humans, there's a higher energy consumption. So better for the environment in that sense, and higher dollar value back into the value chain. So we've expanded our mission in that way, or expanded the terminology or metrics we're measuring to provide more value into the chain, and sort of utilize the resource as well. And so expanding terms, but continuing impact is sort of that real importance there. And then when we think about sort of the consumer, the customer we're delivering to, for us, our growth has enabled us to reach more people and save more food. And so when we think about sort of growing our footprint, both geographically, but also consumer footprint, how can we access more folks, create more sort of, I say food access, but I literally just mean delivering more food. And then from there, how can we reach more populations that didn't have food before? And so that's, as someone chimed in the chat, Imperfect does have, we offer a reduced cost box program. So for folks that are eligible for SNAP or EBT, it's a little broader, but it's about 130% of the federal poverty line. We enable you to get a 20% discount on your groceries every week. And we want to make sure that no matter where we're delivering, you have that choice and dignity to shop with us and get food delivered directly to your door. And that's about, okay, what are we good at? We're great at delivering boxes of food. How can we do that even better? It's create more equity in that opportunity. So again, that the question you asked me, V, is how can you not lose sight of your vision, but also keep growing? And for us, it's been really thinking, what are we good at? And then with growth, what does that enable? And how can we do more of that? So our reduced cost box program, for example, has grown over 250% in the last year. And so with the challenging economic social times of the COVID pandemic, we've been able to see that we can keep delivering and we can reach more people and provide more equity in delivery that others aren't able to offer or aren't choosing to offer, going back to this being a choice. And how can we do more of that? And so for us, it's building a better food system, a food system and the areas that we can have control over, which is sourcing more food, putting more back in, and then how can we deliver more to a broader swath of folks, all while enabling sort of a better environmental and social outcome than the typical grocery store or grocery delivery even.
Right. And I love what you said about there being, there's better language now to the problem and to the systems and to the ways that we're moving about solving this solution. And as we continue to grow that language and continue to share what exactly this means, we go from let's end world hunger to like, let's systemically fix the piece that's broken, which is food going to rot in the field because there's not enough truckers. Okay, well, why aren't there enough truckers? Like now we can actually sort of work it back into like a more clinical look at the food system to say, okay, these are the root systemic issues, and then these are the symptoms that are manifesting as a part of these root causes of that illness. And Claire, I want to come to you because you have a wonderful way of explaining this, but for social entrepreneurs who are thinking about how they can apply their passion and talent to the food system, understanding that food drives healing and health in communities, what are some of the levers of systemic transformation that you're focused on and that folks could kind of start to dig more deeply into?
Yes, sorry about that. Levers of transformation. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really critical that we do look systemically, like you were just saying, V, and look at those root causes. And I think that all of us have a huge role to play in advocating for the reallocation of resources essentially towards what we want, the world we want and the food system we want, which is one in which food is not wasted and where food is healthy, affordable, available, fair, where workers are treated right, where individuals have the opportunity to, prosper in their own entrepreneurial activities, et cetera. And I think what I want to say about this is that government budgets have a really huge role to play in all of this, and public resources. And, we often don't stop and think about how we might consider food a human right. Like everyone deserves food, everyone needs food to live, right? It's just sort of baseline to live. But so much of how food comes to us is actually through the private market economy, which is why the Imperfect Foods and the EveryTables of the world are important, because we're sort of demonstrating that there's another way to do business in the food system. But, in the same way that water flows out of our taps and we see the roads and infrastructure that government could pay for, what if there was more public support for food to really protect and ensure that food truly is a human right? I mean, it takes a level of resource allocation to be able to achieve that. And this is not crazy talk because it has happened in other parts of the world. I would actually lift up, kind of randomly, but interesting for the audience to look into, Belo Horizonte, Brazil is known as the city that ended hunger. Why? Because they allocated significant resources to making sure that everyone did in fact have food. I think, Maddie brought up a really great point about what we saw happen in the last year with the pandemic. Food insecurity and hunger did not start during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was always there. It was exacerbated, it was multiplied. And for the first time in a generation, there were hundreds of thousands, upwards of millions of people who were in lines at food banks who had never in their life gone and sought food aid, right? And thank goodness our local cities and counties actually did step up to sponsor a lot of that and make it happen. But what if that investment had already happened 10 years ago? We would have had much more resiliency. We would have had the ability to mitigate the severity of hunger and inequity that we saw, that also happened to exacerbate rates of death in COVID-19, right? I mean, making that upfront investment results in significant cost savings for society. So I think, to your question about what can we do and sort of where can people fit in, using our voices together to support market interventions like the kind we're talking about, Maddie and I, representing companies that do that, but also realizing that it's going to take an all hands on deck effort that includes our local governments, nonprofit sector, of course, community sector, as well as social enterprise working hand in hand to really shift allocation of resources to transform the system.
And we have a great question that just came in from Diana Lloyd-Jones, who was asking about, there's this this idea of the hourglass food system. There's an awful lot of food produced, a ton of food produced, some of it for product making, some of it for eating it. There's an awful lot of money. The USDA has the biggest budget and all the government, second only to the military, to get people to make the food. And then it kind of like skinnies out. And then you have a bottom side where there's all these people who want food, but it's just not coming through because it's not connected. There's not an incentive. There's a government incentive to grow and produce the food, but there's not a government incentive follow through to effectively work on logistics, improve highways, improve the ways that we move food around, improve how we distribute the food to the people, you know. So it wasn't on our prep document, but it's a really good question. So if either one of you have anything you want to comment on as it relates to how do we fix this hourglass situation of the food system?
I'm like, yeah, who's going first? Claire just gave me the head nod. No, it's such a good question. And I wish I had a simple, succinct answer is the truth. It's super complicated because like, why should this be happening, right? The only positive thing I can say is that the more research that's coming out that's highlighting exactly what the challenges are, and I sort of give Google Food, even Feeding America are putting out some great sort of requests of what is needed. Because when I think about sort of going back to your original question to me, why are food banks not the only answer? A lot of them don't have refrigeration, right? And refrigeration is one of the best ways to keep food from going to waste. And so just investment in infrastructure in cold chain, it's not sexy. And that's why I'm like, the answers are infrastructure, the answers are cold chain, the answers are, you know, better logistics. Right now, if anyone's in sort of food supply chain, it's where's the lane? Is there a stop on the lane? So lanes are very specific of where food travels, and it's hard to break that. And so it's some of these really unsexy solutions that are needed to put money into, and at least these organizations are, and these are not new solutions, I should say. So when I give these nonprofits credit for bringing back up the solutions, it's that they've never stopped like banging on the wall to say, this is what we need. And I give them credit for that continued will to say, this is still what we need, because the investments just aren't going to the places that are going to make this problem easier to solve.
Yeah, I would just co-sign on infrastructure. I think that's a great point. And we don't have to look further to, and this is not meant to be any kind of disrespect to the really important food relief efforts that happened in the last year, but we did see a lot of, at least here in the Los Angeles area, I'm sure elsewhere, a lot of, you know, food donation mobilizations where food was out for hours, moved around in kind of bags and boxes, put into people's individual cars, personal cars, and then driven all over, you know, the city and county. There's food safety issues there. There's also just a total lack of efficiency, right? I mean, look at how we as community have to just patchwork together in a time of crisis, a way to move food. So to Maddie's point, if we had more locally owned and kind of community empowering distribution infrastructure, cold storage infrastructure, like Maddie was saying, if we had those investments in place prior to the pandemic, I think it would have just looked so much different. Again, I think we would have mitigated a lot of the harm and the violence of hunger that we saw in the last year. And it's not sexy, and it takes a lot of advocacy. I want to sort of lift up and shout out as an example of something I think is sort of promising. New Jersey signed a law earlier this year mandating their economic development authority for the state to invest about $40 million to food system investments, with the objective being to reduce and eliminate food insecurity. $40 million a year for the next several years. Now we're talking. I mean, that, and again, imagine if that had been 10 years ago. What would have the last year look like? And what could we expect again then in another scenario where we're hit with something? I mean, there will be other shocks to the system. And that's really what the theory of resiliency is about, is the expectation that there's going to be shocks to the system. There's going to be breakdowns in the system. But resiliency is your ability to bounce back. And I think to the tune of $40 million a year investing in people, community food resources, that's gonna really reduce the impact of when the next time the shock happens.
Yeah, that's the Garden State in action, right? They got a new Democratic governor and signing in some great legislation showing up. I love that. That is awesome. On that same, sort of vein, a couple questions have come in about how do we push food businesses to prioritize social impacts and mission over profits? Like what is investment in startups that have a mission? What is the marketing behind? What's the consumer demands behind? I had read an article recently saying that millennial consumers base 47% of their decisions on the mission behind that particular company. Like they will make an active choice as the emerging number one buyer of things coming up to say, is this a good product? Is this a good company? And there's less of a focus on, is it the cheapest price, which used to be, I feel like, people were a little bit more value driven, whether they needed to be or not in some cases. But in people with disposable income, who are they investing in? Where are they buying? And this idea of being a good follow through traceable mission really is taking a front seat for folks in the way that they're building. I watched that Bo Burnham special. If anybody hasn't watched it, you should watch it. But it's like, you're not supporting wheat thins, you're supporting wheat thins ending world hunger, right? Will you support that? And how that is kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. So do either of you have insight to how social enterprise funding has changed over the last 5 years? Like how are the suits on Wall Street responding to this new demand? And is there even more opportunity now for folks to do the right thing and get funding to do that?
I can jump first. Yeah, I've been amazed. I mean, V, to your point about the millennial consumer, but also employment, is another thing where people want to go work for companies that have a mission or are driving social good. And I think that those two are sort of on the marketing or people team. That's an incredible sort of fact and area to look into, because people want to support companies and people want to work for companies that are driving forward real change. And brand loyalty is so real, and people supporting companies and wanting to come back, and that reorder, that repurchase, that return comes from really believing in a company. And no longer is that just value, but that's also who are you and what do you support, and also what's your customer service. And I think that fun sort of tie in together is a real new change that we're all seeing. When it comes to funding, it's following the same path. So we've been, I've been amazed to watch sort of no care to really expedited care from funders and investment. And Imperfect went through our Series D, in January. And we had our two ESG, or environmental social governance investors, Hamilton Lane and Blyce, come on. And that was a real shift and change in paradigm for us of not only can you get sort of VCs and private equity who want to invest in change, but also you can get investors who have expectations of this, and you can pass their criteria. So I'm seeing more and more VCs and private equity wanting to invest in disruptors, which has been a history of Imperfect, of folks betting and choosing on Imperfect because we're disrupting the food system, and wanting to see that happen in the same way that someone would invest in, a different type of company who I will, not name, that's making change in their system. Now this is change and disruption for good. As well as sort of the ESG folks are raising their capital banks and being able to invest in new companies. So both sides of it.
Yeah, and Claire, seeing a similar.
Definitely. I would add that over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a growth of what could broadly be called healthy food financing initiatives. And this is really driven by a combination of government and philanthropy and the private sector sort of pooling capital resources to drive towards systemic change in the food system by investing in community enterprise, whether that's a grocery store or a small neighborhood market or a farm operation, et cetera. And so I think the New Jersey law, for example, sort of represents the next generation in these sort of healthy food financing initiatives. Here in California, we've got something called the California Freshworks Fund. And these are funds that can move multiple millions of dollars for huge capital projects, but they also make capital available to small businesses, to startup entrepreneurs, to mom and pop corner stores and bodegas. I mean, it's truly, it's kind of diversified in terms of how this money can move and at what level it can transact. I think that's an opportunity for folks in the audience who are sort of considering where can I go? And I also think there's a huge role to play for philanthropy. And I wanted to say that social equity franchising, the program that I described earlier, isn't unique to EveryTable. And in fact, we hope it's not. We hope that it changes the way franchising happens, because as I stated earlier, franchising, like so many other industries, perpetuates inequity and perpetuates privilege, because it's really rooted in who's got access to resources now. Philanthropy, foundations have major endowments. They're investing that money. Some of it's going to grant making, but a lot of it is also being invested. Well, what would it look like for them to invest in social equity franchising models that are opening up and unlocking economic opportunities for historically disenfranchised entrepreneurs across the entire food system? Again, bigger than EveryTable, bigger than even kind of the model that we have. I think that's another opportunity to look at, and something that would be my call to action, I think, for philanthropy, in particular, when we think about funding for social enterprise. And then the other thing, I wanted to mention is that you use the word transparency a couple times in what you were talking about, and how that's driving consumer choices. And that is one of the greatest obstacles I think that we face as people who care about this issue, is that it's very obscure where food comes from and how many hands it passes through. And I think, there's companies like Imperfect Foods or EveryTable that are saying, hey, we'll open up the books and talk to you about exactly where this food is coming from, because you deserve to know. But as consumer advocates, we have to continuously ask for visibility on the supply chain. And there's policy drivers for achieving that as well. Sorry to keep coming back to this, but I think it's important. And for New Yorkers out there, there's great momentum happening on the Good Food Purchasing Policy, which is a policy that basically says we as a government purchasing foods, whether it's senior meals or meals for foster youth or meals for homeless shelters, we are going to buy from suppliers that will show us where their food comes from and show us what kind of practices are happening all up and down the supply chain. And you can achieve that through policy, right? That's now a mandate that the city of New York is saying to food vendors out there. And I, for one, am totally for it. I think it makes sense. And as a food company, we would say, yes, like, let's talk, come look at where we're sourcing from and come look at all the supply chain conditions, because it's through that transparency and visibility that we're able to actually solve problems. If you don't know what the challenges are because you can't fully see them, how are you going to be able to solve for them, right? So it really starts with that.
Right, and we do still live in a capitalist society, so it has to make sense for all the players. And I think what we're seeing more and more is that it does make sense. I saw a commercial yesterday from Gerber Baby Food, who used something that we've been saying for years and years, which is I can tell you which farmer picked from which farm on what day, because that was the traceability that we had in our supply chains. And Gerber Foods has now illustrated that for the average American watching at home, who's like, oh, that's so cool. Didn't that make you feel safer about what you were feeding your baby, especially in the wake of some of the other complicated things that Gerber's going through right now? But that was their reaction, right? And that's because it makes sense in a capitalist society, because they know that people want that transparency, they want that mission, and they want to see that farmer waving with the bale of kale. They need a visual to put to it. And that's why it's so important. The more opportunities we have with our e-commerce, which we're going to get to quickly because we only have 15 minutes left, and the way that we tell our stories, resetting what people's visuals are when they're deciding who they're investing in and who deserves to eat and how they deserve to eat and all that kind of stuff. And to answer one of the questions really quick that came through about our program, specifically FoodFarmacy, and how we navigated health insurance to get funding for the partnership, it's not exactly health insurance. There is a large amount of money that is available in investment for community and population health funding. And a lot of that has to do with trying to mitigate other costs. So if we are able to convince, let's say, a health network that if you deliver fresh produce and you deliver prepared meals to people who lack in food literacy, lack in food access, and are struggling with diabetes, let's say, that the cost of taking care of that patient will be lower. So we are being paid out of the savings of providing better care, which has been years and years and years in the making, trying to convince people of that. And it is really in its infancy right now, something that that is working. I will say alongside of that, and going back to policy again, there is a hesitancy to publish a lot of the research that surrounds these programs, and showing that if you provide food insecure folks with diabetes consistent food and it costs, let's say, $120 a month or something, and the hospital takes on that cost, they'll save this amount in treating that patient overall. Because if they publish that, that person may also be on SNAP or WIC or other government benefits, and because they're getting food from one space, they may be disqualified from getting food in another space, even though it takes both programs to feed them. So way complicated thing. I would love to do another session on that and just the ways that we get around that, because it's bananas, Bill. But if you follow us on here, I promise you we will publish something soon about the issues that surround that. Moving quickly into our last 13 minutes here, talking about equity for our people, right? So we're doing all that we can to serve the folks that we care about. We're doing all that we can to serve the farmers and the people who work within the process. What about the folks that work for us? And what about breaking down some of the restrictions to getting a good job that there were before? In particular, college degrees. Do we require them? Should it be required? Do you have to be certified in something to be able to work in one of these companies or in one of these structures? Or is it something that social enterprise should be pushing to say, obviously, college degree, education, incredibly important, but there's also life skill and work skill, and there's the School of Hard Knocks and Street Smart, and how valuable is that? And what can social enterprises like ours be doing to say, this is an issue that requires creative thinking and not necessarily just academic performance thinking? So wanted to give you guys a chance to talk about just some of the ways that you recruit talent and some of the things that you guys value at each of your companies. Maybe Maddie, start.
Do you want me to go? Yeah, I could jump in here, Maddie. Well, to answer the question, no, we don't require college degrees. And I think that's a really good question. And it's a good question because it highlights sort of an outdated mode of thinking about experience and expertise. And also about career pathways in the food industry, right? I mean, I actually think food as an industry is a pretty low barriers to entry field overall. There's a lot of ways to get into working at an EveryTable, for example. And there's a lot of different career pathways. And I think one measure of equity is better defining those pathways of opportunity, especially for people who don't have that background or kind of coming in new. For us, the way we practice talent recruitment with an eye towards our mission is all about partnerships, linking with existing organizations that are doing some level of workforce development, supporting individuals who have barriers to employment. Maybe they, were recently incarcerated or transitioning out of homelessness, or face other economic barriers that have kind of held them back. For example, in LA, we've worked with Homeboy Industries. So they're working with like former gang affiliated folks and helping them kind of reestablish their lives. So we've partnered with them on both culinary projects as well as hiring, or a group called Chrysalis. They are helping people who are sort of post homelessness and are, now housed and receiving services. In the New York area, even though we're not yet in New York, I hope to be working closely with a group called Driving Change, and they also work with individuals coming out of the carceral system. So, I mean, we don't have to start from scratch. That's the good news. It's all about linking and leveraging and connecting the dots. In the social equity franchise program, we're doing the same thing too. We're working with the YWCA. They have a women's entrepreneurship program. Their graduates are then recruited into our training program, which is called EveryTable University. And that's what sets people on the course to become an owner operator. So for me, it's all about connecting the dots. And it sounds easier said than done, I guess, but that's the opportunity that we all have, is through partnerships. And that's how we can give folks an opportunity to really kind of take that pathway forward and grow in their own prosperity in this industry.
Makes sense, because we hear a lot the rhetoric about labor shortage, but I haven't had that experience, and I think that's because if you are investing in the people who are working for you, then you are never short for talent because they want to be there with you. They feel like they're going to be respected. There's maybe a labor shortage of folks who are willing to get screamed at for $7 an hour, but there's not a labor shortage of people who want to work and who want to feel valued and like they're a part of something that means something. And Maddie, I think you can speak to that about the culture at Imperfect too.
Yeah, and I think to what you just said, there's
a labor challenge. And I think one of the ways that we've worked with it is partnering with our nonprofit folks in our space to basically work as, we're a friend of a friend, right?
Yeah.
Salvation Army and Goodwill in Chicago just gave us a great recommendation to a ton of their folks that they're working with to transition out of homelessness. And they came and worked for us, right? And so it's this partnership idea of, we have trust in the community, and therefore you should trust that we're a great employer. And the only thing I can add to what Claire, sort of mentioned, because we have very similar practices on nonprofit partnering around, helping people sort of come out of incarceration or out of homelessness and get employed. The only thing we can add that hasn't been talked about is also that development up. So some of our favorite delivery managers, or even now work on sort of marketing or engineering, started as Packlight associates, and having that ability and flexibility to say, hey, start here because this is where there's an open spot, and let's figure out what you love to do and where we can help you grow. That's been, one of our longest term employees, started as a delivery driver and now QAs all of our engineering code. And she had never been an engineer prior. So through this, and she's outlasted so many of our employees. She's been here since, day 15, let's call it, of Imperfect. Yeah. And it's that sort of ability to say, we want you to come work here and we want to foster your growth in whatever that looks like.
Right, because we're fixing society. The mission of the company is to apply compassion and empathy and food security to this community, but we have to have that within our own community as well, right? Like I remember one time working for a company and it was a restaurant and the lowest cost dish was $50. And I was like, I couldn't even afford to eat here and I have to work here. Like, that's very discouraging to somebody. I knew I never wanted to be in that situation again, and it is that treat, and when somebody is talented in a particular position, you may have somebody who's the best, farm stand setter upper in all the lands. Like, don't hold them down there because they'll go set up somebody else's farm stand one day who gives them better opportunities. So it's like encouraging people and growing them, and they are part of the community. We're all part of the community we're serving and working within. And to quickly rapid fire through a few of these questions, Maddie, what would you call food waste to better market it to customers? Surplus, extra?
Delicious food.
Delicious food.
Yeah, call it surplus, call it excess, but it's really just food, saved food that needs a home. It's just food. Our dream one day is that an ugly carrot or a wonky carrot is just a carrot.
Perfect. And then breaking down the stigma associated with food donations, I think that's an ongoing thing. We've done it in ways where we've hosted farmers market at hospitals, and you've got the head of cardiology shopping the same exact market as West Baltimore single dad, and it just is creating these spaces where people are communally purchasing food that was grown in their neighborhood or near their business, and that everybody is searching from. So it's not like, oh, you go to Aldi or you go to Whole Foods. And like, secret for you guys, Aldi gets a lot of the short code that goes to Whole Foods. So it's the same food in a lot of the cases. Like, don't tell anyone, tell everyone I told you that. So we're just breaking down those brand alliances, the idea of like elite food versus regular food. It's all, grown in a very similar fashion. Let's see, last thing, e-commerce, just quick, because you all have a touch, taste, feel product, but it's oftentimes something you're having to reach people through digitally. Any tip on how to get mission and taste across digitally with the last 1 minute?
I mean, for us, it helps that we have several different channels to get food to people, so people can try our food in a retail environment and then say, wow, this is fabulous, and I want to order it online and have it sent to my house every week, which we do. We also have vending machines, so we're in a lot of offices and college campuses and hospitals. So again, a different touch point where someone can interact with the product and then decide, yeah, this is something I want to subscribe to. Maddie could say more, but I've seen Imperfect produce out at farmers markets and lots of community events. Similarly, where it's like, we're here, we're real people, it's real food. And then you have the opportunity to follow up online. But yeah, that's how we approach it.
Yeah, I mean, huge market, right? E-commerce growing. The more that you can tell the story and create sort of transparency through online shopping. I've worked in e-commerce for 10 years in food, and 6 years ago, you had to convince people that it was okay to shop online. Now this is the norm. So we're sort of watching trends move in a different direction. What I will say that Imperfect does that I think is so special and why I've loved what we've done even before I worked here is sharing that imperfection reason. So, this lemon is too small, and by too small, someone is grading that somewhere, but so you're expecting small lemons when you're expecting scarred apples because of the hailstorm, and being able to tell that story, which we're finding more and more ability on an online platform. But it's about building trust. So if you trust what the stories we're telling you, we tell you as much as we can and have built a brand around transparency, going back to previous conversations, then you know what you're going to get. And so the more, transparency you can build and trust you can build as a brand through an e-commerce channel, the better.
And to answer Erin's question, which is the last one in here about community food fridges and grocery stores or restaurants donating leftovers to causes to help balance the scales, the system is not for lack of donation. There is so much food that gets donated, and in fact, there's only so much that they can manage, and there's so much that they can connect. And in some cases, what we need to do is put less of an emphasis on everything needing to be free and understanding the different balance that needs to take place. Some people are always going to need free food, totally. Then there's like subsidized, then there's, kind of discounted, then there's full price. But when we are considering food equity solutions, there has to be money behind them, or they can't work, right? So we can lean on volunteer labor to a point, and then at what point are we displacing a potentially really good paying job that should be invested in with volunteer labor that is not exact, it's there when it's there and it's not when it's not. And so like we've been saying throughout this, the partnership of not-for-profits and the partnership of social enterprise, and also just fixing some of the junk that went on when they built the food system and drove the cost of food to be so incredibly cheap. It doesn't need to be as cheap as it is. Making it this cheap has actually made it really expensive in some cases overall, is where we're going to have, I think, a really new impact. And it does feel like we are in the infancy of that change. I think people are decidedly choosing to either eat less meat because they want a better quality meat, to eat more vegetables, and they don't care what they look like anymore. It doesn't have to be the perfect, waxy apple anymore. And I think those changes, my grandma used to say, skirts only get so short before the maxi dress is back in. It's like things went so far this way that now we're kind of coming back to this way. People want to know their farmer. They want to meet the people they're working with. They want to believe in the mission, and they want to see all the way through that what they're investing in with their money is making a difference for themselves, for their families, for their future, and for the system at large, just being more efficient and joyful. So that is our time. I feel like we could have gone for like 2 hours, and I promise you we'll do a whole other thing on why healthcare research can't be published and whatnot. I'll tell Sam we got to do it again. But I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We heard some incredible just insights from Clare and Maddie on their businesses. To learn more about them, you can visit everytable.com or imperfectfoods.com. I'm Vitus Spehar, the Executive Director of everythingfood.com. You can find all three of us at the same time at foodfarmacy.com. I also host a daily news recap at Under the Desk News on TikTok and Instagram. I want to thank Teresa, Sam, and the folks at the Sanitation Foundation for having us today. And I want to leave you all with just one final point, which is that more than 35 million Americans live in households that struggle against hunger. 1 in 10 households in the US experience food insecurity. But with empathetic leadership and innovation in the way we grow, distribute, and value food, we can continue to drive down the rate of hunger while improving the overall health of our nation. And take care. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.